Hi, and welcome to the first episode of my Paladin podcast. And today we're going to look at a book that I read very early on in COVID. Just before everything shut down, I went to my local library, shout out to the Lansdale Library, and I was looking at the nonfiction section. And a book caught my eye, and it was the book The Intelligence Trap by David Robson. Why Smart People Make Dumb Mistakes. And this title caught my attention for a couple different reasons. One is I fancy myself as smart, and I have quite a bit of wallpaper, expensive wallpaper, and so people would probably label me as smart. And I work in an institution of higher learning, and so most of my colleagues would be put in that same category of smart. And most of us would probably take being smart as a compliment. But here comes this book and says that because we are smart, we are not only capable of making dumb mistakes, but maybe more capable of making dumb mistakes. So I was intrigued. And I got the book, looked at it, and read it, and I think it's a very interesting book and the claims that he makes. It starts out with the claim that just because you are very logical and smart doesn't mean he wants to prove that we don't necessarily make the wisest choices. Like Nobel Prize winners who believe in aliens. The most vivid one for me was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes. And if you know anything about Sherlock Holmes, you know it's based on logic and elementary, my dear Watson, and all about thinking carefully. And yet, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle believed in mediums and all kinds of other things that have no rational basis, and yet he was easily fooled, and later on some of the people who fooled him wrote books about how they fooled him, and his interaction with another fella of his day, Harry Houdini, whose whole point was to make people think they see something that they really don't see. And so that's just an example of one person who would be looked at as really smart but capable of making some really dumb mistakes. So I'm kind of intrigued by this and trying to think to myself, are my colleagues and I in a bad way because we're so smart? So why do smart people make dumb mistakes? Well, there's a few reasons. I'm not going to give you every one in the book, but I thought a couple of them were pretty interesting to me. One is called tunnel thinking. In other words, I have a degree in psychology, and so I tend to think when it comes to psychology that I have expertise, and maybe I do. But the more degrees that I get in psychology, or the more experience I have with clients or teaching, I tend to lose the capacity to think that I could do anything wrong, especially when it comes to psychology, because I have been deemed an expert in psychology. And so it becomes more and more difficult for me to admit that I might be wrong, which is a point that he's going to make. Related to that is called generalized expertise. So not only do I think I'm smart because I have a degree in psychology, and that makes me smart when we're talking about psychology, but the idea is that those of us who have advanced degrees are probably smarter in everything else too. That's why generalized anxiety. And so I am smarter than the average man, not just when it comes to psychology, but when it comes to history or philosophy or theology or engineering or medicine or biology or anything else. I should probably be listened to because I have expertise in one area. And that's just a big fallacy that Robson talks about, is that just because you have an advanced degree in something doesn't mean you're really smart in everything else. So can I go talk to a class about attachment theory, for example, which I do know a lot about, but then when it comes time to understand chemistry, am I willing to humble myself and go talk to the chemistry professor and say, I'm about as smart as any one of your students when it comes to this, okay? So another thing is called confirmation bias. We've talked about tunnel thinking and generalized expertise. Another one he brings up is called confirmation bias, and this is susceptible to all of us. Is once you make your mind up on something, you start to interpret data in light of that. Like you've already decided that you've made a good decision, and so now you're going to keep doing it. The classic example from psychology is that you buy a boat, and the boat has a hole in it. So rather than say, oh shucks, I bought a boat with a hole in it, instead you say, no, I bought a boat that requires my creative imagination or something. You make up some reason why you didn't just buy a boat with a hole in it. And that's called confirmation bias, that you kind of look for information that supports your own views. Another one would be familiar to those of you in either education or psychology or other areas, Gardner's idea of thinking slow versus thinking fast. And that when you think fast, you tend to make efficient decisions, but oftentimes wrong decisions. And those of us who have advanced degrees or would be put in the category of smart, we tend to think we can think even faster about everything. That's the generalized expertise again. That because we know a lot about one thing, we know a lot about all other things, and we can think fast, and we don't have to think slow, which is what the simple folk have to do when they make decisions. And then one last thing he mentions, which is kind of convicting to me, is that smart people can rationalize their decisions so much better. In other words, maybe you've been in a discussion with somebody and you know they're wrong, but the way they talk just weaves a web and you get completely lost in all the verbiage or the pseudo logic or whatever. And you end up realizing, okay, this person can come up with all kinds of reasons why their stupid view is actually brilliant. It's kind of the old, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, and some of you are old enough to know how the rest of that phrase goes. But anyway, so those are kinds of some ideas that Robson brings up with us about why smart people not only make bad decisions, but are kind of susceptible to making bad decisions. There are some blind spots in us. So what's the hope Robson talks about? What's the hope? Well, his one big hope is called wisdom. And he actually somehow reduces wisdom down to being empirically validated. I'm not sure about that, but his whole idea is wisdom, that you can think rationally about decisions, that you can learn from your mistakes. Two examples he mentions. One is that you can learn from your mistakes. Can you actually realize, number one, that you made a mistake, and then number two, learn from your mistake and not do it again? And he says that those of us who are on Team Smart might not be very good at that. And then can you listen to alternative views? And again, those of us who are on Team Smart probably are not real eager to hear alternative views because we've spent our whole life building our views and we think we're probably right. And so wisdom is what Robson says is the cure or the antidote for all the stupid things that we do, and that we are capable of still, as smart people, making some pretty dumb decisions. And as I was reading that section, I kept saying, ouch, ouch. So from a Christian perspective, is there any hope for me and my colleagues? Or are we just going to keep making dumb decisions because we're so smart? As I was reading through this, though, from a Christian perspective, I kept thinking about a passage in Romans chapter 1 where it says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And so the Apostle Paul in this passage is, I think, saying the same thing as our book today, is he's saying that it's possible to not only be wise or pretend to be wise, and in those days that would have been wisdom based on philosophy, which would be overlapping a lot with what we call smart today. But anyway, it's possible to be really, really smart and make really dumb decisions. So the Apostle Paul mentions that in Romans 1, and this is part of a cascade that if you look at the context, you see that this begins with turning your back on God. And then a bunch of dominoes fall after that, because when you turn your back on God, you have nothing left but to worship something that looks like God. And so you end up worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. And that's where that passage, professing yourself to be wise, you become a fool, is put in. That's one of the dominoes that falls. And it ends up with degrading behavior as you look at the rest of Romans chapter 1. So not only do we make foolish decisions, but we end up degrading ourselves and acting in ways that are not even close to being reflective of our image-bearing capacity. So Romans 1, I think the Apostle Paul understood that smart people possibly have a blind spot. And this is also mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where God says, not many wise, not many noble will make it into the kingdom. So there seems to be a barrier there. But Romans, another passage that comes to my mind is Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, that says, The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So I agree with the book that wisdom is the solution, but I'm thinking before you can be wise, you have to have some framework for all of that. And for the Christian, that framework is the beginning is the fear of the Lord. And that fear of the Lord, apparently, according to Proverbs, helps us make better decisions because our wisdom is based on that. And so what does it mean to be fear of the Lord? Well, we don't have time to get into all of that, but I think part of it has to do with the awe of the Lord, with including him in our decisions, with our recognition that he exists, that he's good, that he has a claim on our lives. All of those things, I think, could be included into the fear of the Lord. And when you start there, then the decisions that emerge from that presupposition have a chance of not being so stupid, okay? So we have a chance. So there's hope for me and my colleagues. And I guess I'll just close with the passage in 1 Corinthians that I mentioned earlier, where it says, there is not many mighty, not many noble, not many wise. I've always been comforted, the longer I've been in education, I've always been comforted by that passage doesn't say not any wise. And so I've always taken that as God has a quota where he's got a few slots in the kingdom reserved for those of us that are really smart, but probably make dumb mistakes. And the majority of people in the kingdom aren't really, really smart like us. But there's a few slots available for people like us who oftentimes don't trust as quick as the people who maybe wouldn't be recognized as smart. So there is hope for me and my colleagues, and that's the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. Hope you have enjoyed this. We'll see you next time.